Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. My name is Pascal Lotta, and I am joined today again by my friend and colleague, Dr. Warwick Powell. Warwick, welcome back.
Great to be with you, Pascal.
Warwick, you wrote a wonderful new book. Let me try to show it here. It is called Thermodynamics in a Time of Monsters, Rethinking Theory, China and International Geopolitical Economy. This is what we want to talk about. And actually, your approach has very much to do with what is going on today with Iran. So first of all, congratulations to your new book. And second of all, can you tell us a little bit why this idea of thermoeconomics is so relevant right now to understand the conflict that is unfolding in front of our eyes?
Look, basically, the argument is that human societies and social economic systems are grounded in our ability as human beings to harness the thermodynamic potential of the world, to overcome the entropy that is intrinsic to the dynamics of thermodynamics, and continually engage in processes of energetic renewal, because that's how we generate the surpluses that we need to sustain the complex systems that we actually have developed. So that's the sort of underlying theoretical tone, I guess. The way that it dovetails into the situation that is tragically unfolding in West Asia is that in many ways we can approach this conflict as an expression of the contradictions at the heart of different regimes of thermoeconomic accumulation. So for the best part of 100 odd years, and particularly since the 1960s, the global economic landscape, buttressed by American military power, has been tied very much to the ongoing developments and availability of low energetic cost energy sources, particularly oil and gas from West Asia. So the way in which the economic system, the economic metabolism can power ahead is by accessing what I call high energetic return on energetic investment possibilities. And what West Asia, the Gulf states offered was precisely that at global scale. The
So what do you
problem
mean?
is
Sorry, just what you mean is you get a lot of energy for pretty cheap exploitation, right?
pretty cheap effort, right? So just think of it as effort, right? You put in a certain amount of effort to get access to a bunch of stored future possibility. And so one barrel of oil does the work of, so many humans for 5 years, for example, measured in pure energetic terms. So this is how powerful an energetic resource this particular part of the world has been, and why it has been so central to late stage industrialization.
Yeah.
And we are now witnessing the manifestations of all sorts of schisms that are emerging within the fundamental substrates of how, particularly the leading economies, have in many ways sat on their hands. Not necessarily by choice, but I'm talking particularly about the United States, where it has, in many ways, institutionally and politically, lost sight of the need for energetic renewal and has become uh, trapped in a process of entropy. It's becoming less cohesive, it's fragmenting, and that's a symptom of a progressive, though obviously initially hard to view, reduction in the overall energetic efficiency of the system at large. And so as systems, in a sense, torture themselves to deal with the fact that they've got less energetic surpluses to do all the things that civilizations have tried to do, they begin to lash out because there are distributive consequences. There is actually less surplus energy to go around, and different societies and institutions deal with these symptoms in different ways. In the United States, some of the ways that we've actually seen these problems manifest themselves is in homelessness and those sorts of problems, right? But these are worldwide problems. They're problems to do with the constraints, if you will, that nature continues to impose upon us. We've had a great run for a couple of 100 years, and but it is actually getting in for a lot of places around the world that the foundations of that particular run are now getting less energetically efficient to access.
This is a very interesting way of putting a couple of the problems that we've been talking on this channel for quite a while. I mean, and the concept that you're using here again, like thermoeconomics in a time of monsters, and we're gonna get to the monsters part in a second. But basically, what you're saying is the United States is tumbling towards societal heat death through this entropy because they're no more. I mean, it's not growing, not as an economy, but as a productive output, right? Society, and that then all impacts how energy is being used. And just one more point I find is very fascinating, that of course we have to somehow measure energy, and energy is a very abstract concept, even though we're very used to it. And how, we saw how at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, combustion engines started to be measured, of course, in horsepowers, right? How much horsepower does this output give us? And I think this is very important to this discussion about the energy density of certain materials and these hydrocarbons from West Asia. Yeah, they change the energy equilibrium. Maybe can you talk to that a
Yeah,
little bit? Maybe
absolutely.
again about how you think that this war and the cutting of trade relations then impacts the entire global system of distribution.
So I guess the way that I try to think about the system at large is to view it as an integrated whole. And the integrated whole is anchored by our understanding of the natural material world. And the natural material world, our planet, is an energetic world. There is an amount of energy available in the world, and it transforms and it takes new forms over time, and it's continually in motion. If that's the sort of envelope, if you will, the energetic envelope, what we seek to do as humans is to harness the energies available to us and mobilize that, store it, and use it to produce things that societies uh, find useful and necessary. So, what I try and do is distinguish between two ways of conceptualizing this question of economic value, because these are economic systems, and use values are the ways that I think we can approach this question of energy. Of course, we can measure energy in terms of joules and kilowatts and horsepower and those sorts of things, but in a slightly more abstract sense, I try to think of energy really as value in motion, and value in motion transforms through productive engagements with it by humans, and we do this in a few different important ways, and they're fundamental ways. They're ontologically necessary ways. And they go to the fact that all human societies need food for people and fuel for machines, right? Now, we didn't need so much fuel for machines prior to having lots of machines, but we did certainly need fuel for horses and oxen and those sorts of things, right? Um, and and we as humans, as biological material bundles of energy, right, as vectors of energy, we also transform energy through the ways in which we consume it uh, with nutrition, and then use that nutrition to exert ourselves in different ways, whether it's mental exertion, the work that we do mentally, physically, and through that we continue the cycle, if you will, of energetic transformation. Now, the more successful human societies have become in having lower cost ways of harnessing energy that can be stored and reused and used down the track, high density energy, has enabled the flourishing of complex human civilizations, right? But all of that superstructure is premised on the idea that we can continue to access high energy return on energy investment sources and have processes that are also energetically efficient. Right? Otherwise, the surplus energy and potential that we are trying to capture and harness and store and have available to us progressively diminishes. Now, for a long time, a lot of that diminution of energetic efficiency is not experienced or is not visible to us, right? Because these are usually slow burn systems, if you will. The way that we tend to deal with all of this is actually through the second component of this system, which is the pricing system, or what I call the system of exchange value.
Right.
So we have use values,
Yeah.
the thermodynamic substrate of material existence on Earth, together with the fact that this circulation system necessitates ways of mobilizing these resources, and with circulating and exchanging these resources amongst units within the economic system that are not internally self-sufficient. We have divisions of labor. And so we have an exchange value system that requires the injection of liquidity into the system, promises, right? The first most generic form of liquidity is what we call money. Right? And money is a claim on the future. Not only is it a unit of account, it is also a right to be able to make a claim either on a future use value, some other energetic form in the future. I can buy something, I can eat it, I can buy fuel, put it in a machine, I can buy machines. Or it enables you to make claims on other kinds of claims, right? I can either exchange it for some other currency, or I can exchange it for conditional claims, shares, options, bonds, right? These are all conditional exchange value claims. None of these things actually drive the thermodynamic system in and of itself, right?
Yep.
They are mobilizers of the resources necessary.
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video. Yeah, this is very so important, this distinction that that you made between value in use and value in exchange.
Yeah.
They're separately, they're fundamentally different, but of course linked between each other. So
They're linked, but not in a determinative way in every moment. And in fact, the systems that we've created over time sees these two worlds diverge regularly.
yeah,
We inject liquidity in the system to grease the wheels. That liquidity expands, but the substrate, the speed at which we can harness energy, transform it, and all those things has a different rhythm. It has its own cadence and temporality. It's a lot slower. We can create claims against the future instantly, right? Either by way of government financing or by way of credit from commercial banks, right? Or by way of private agreements between parties, IOUs.
debt
So
instruments. Yeah, any kind of
those
debt instrument, including the banknotes.
promissory notes, these are promissory notes of one sort or another. We can create those instantly.
Yep.
The issue is whether the substrate, the material substrate, is able to redeem against those claims when those claims become due. Now, when the material substrate can't do that, what does the system actually do? Well, the first thing, fortunately, humans are relatively creative, right? So the first thing we do is that we refinance. We kick the can down the road. We create new instruments. Oh well, we'll just push that one further away. That's one thing. The second thing the system is actually doing all the time is withdrawing liquidity. So it's injecting liquidity and withdrawing liquidity at the same time, right? But the system must have net liquidity growth for GDP to actually expand, right? It cannot expand otherwise. And you cannot have profit without liquidity expansion either. Because what is today's profit, Pascal, is actually yesterday's new liquidity injection. If there was no new liquidity, then the system simply repeats itself. And the balances of income and expenditure always balance out to zero. You only get financial profits if there's net injection of liquidity in the system.
Yeah, I like it that you put it like this, because there's a very large number of commentators on the net who will tell you that the biggest sin of a government will be to get into more and more debt, but you are actually making the opposite case. Without adding debt, you actually you wouldn't be able to.
That's right. So, but and debt is a value and religiously loaded word, actually, because it comes
It is.
from
It is. Yeah.
obligation and all of this. In a fiat promissory note anchored system, a monetary production system, we would be better off thinking about these things as liquidity management tools, right? The management of the volume and flow of promissory notes within the economic system, right? They're not debts, right? They're literally liquidity management tools. The issue with thinking about this isn't that we're going to run out of the possibilities of having future liquidity. Right? There's no chance of that. The problem is actually the extent to which continued liquidity injections exacerbates that widening gap between the fundamental substrate and the claims being made by it. That's the first thing. But there's actually another dimension to all of this too, because just thinking of it that way leads you to say, well, we need public debt equals private surpluses, right? So that's the
Yeah.
sort of
It's the
accounting
M&T
argument.
approach. Yeah.
That and that is an accounting truism. But the social, economic, and political truism is actually that private surplus bit is unevenly distributed and circulated.
Oh yeah.
And because these are claims on the future, right? In other words, the capacity to exercise power over resources, the fact that injecting liquidity into the system grows the pool of liquidity masks the reality that not all systems expand in the same way. So if you keep injecting liquidity in a system where the principal circulation mechanisms deliver more power and more authority to a smaller and smaller group of institutions and people, then you actually create a different kind of society than one that doesn't do that. And you create one that lays the foundations for systemic entropy acceleration. And the reason we have systemic entropy acceleration is because you've got this, firstly, you've got a widening gap between what the material substrate can actually do and what the claims are. But secondly, you've got an uneven claim on the future material substrate, which potentially leaves a growing proportion of people with inadequate access to the surplus energy that they need to sustain their quality of life. Um, so
I
simply
see. I
injecting
see.
more liquidity into the system as a way of overcoming liquidity constraints as companies save more money or what have you, um, can actually make things worse, right?
I
In and of
it,
itself, it says, well, we can keep the monetary circulation going. And I say, well, you could, but unless you're fundamentally changing the circulation mechanisms and transforming the economic substrate where you can attempt to improve your energy return on energy invested foundations, all you're doing is kicking the can of entropy down the road a little bit further.
This is quite fascinating because I thought you would take it the Marxist route and say like, oh, this capital accumulation on within this small group is then going to lead to disproportionate power over the large group, and then you can deploy this large group and exploit them and whatnot. But it's going to run itself out. But you're taking it the other way. You're saying, it's all about how then energy is distributed in the system and how that energy then produces more well, benefits and goods and so on for society to grow, and that one is going down. Therefore, you're increasing the entropy, which of course is a bad thing. You don't want to increase entropy. You want to keep it down because entropy leads us to heat death over
Well,
like
it leads to social implosion, right? Now,
yeah.
I'm pretty conceptually agnostic these days, as I think anyone who reads the book can sort of see that it is really a a synthesis, if you will, of a diverse range of approaches to thinking about problems, and the synthesis itself, I hope, works. It might not, but for mine, I think I'm reasonably satisfied that it works well enough today. Maybe in 2 years' time, I'll look back on it and think, well, it probably, needs a lot more work. Um, but there is no sort of automatic mechanism by which a system will necessarily correct itself, right? So I reject a couple of things, if you will, as fundamental assumptions. I reject the idea that there's a historical teleology, that history is going somewhere, right? And that there's an end point, good or bad, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is that I also reject the idea that the system is somehow intrinsically equilibrium seeking, right? And in fact, my argument is that just like nature, we actually live in a world of flux, that there isn't really a telos that is equilibrium seeking either. And what we actually have is a continual tension, which is actually the motor between systemic fundamental thermodynamic entropy and human attempts to govern that entropic potential through negentropy. Successful societies happen upon ways in which they can do that through high energy return on energy invested, and two, the institutions by which they can then circulate and distribute that in ways that actually mitigate other kinds of system entropies, such as inequality, et cetera, et cetera. The third thing I should add, and this is probably the third leg of the third thread of the conceptual architecture, is the role that information plays in all of this, right? So we've got use values, we've got exchange values. If you think about this in supply chain terms, which obviously is one of my background areas, we're sort of producing things, and that sort of goes in one direction. You know, we harness energy, we make stuff, we sell stuff, et cetera, and it moves through a process. But what's going on the other way is the flow of payments. Okay, so that's your circuit.
Mhm.
Use values in one direction, exchange values in the other direction. But what connects these two things together is actually information. Because without information, at each moment of exchange, the exchange can't function. You cannot exchange a means of payment for a product if you don't know anything about the product and you don't know anything about the supplier, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So information is actually embedded into this system. But information itself isn't some neutral property of the system. It's deeply and fundamentally energetic itself. Information is actually a product that is created using energy. And because it's a product created using energy, it also has inherent in it the prospects of being entropic. Now, this runs counter to most mainstream views of information, which have for the last 60, 70 years viewed information as negentropic in nature, right? My argument is that in fact, there's plenty of examples of information being entropic, where the energetic costs of creating, capturing, storing, distributing, and using that information is greater than the energetic returns of that information being used. Now, put it in plain terms, um, nonsense is a great example. Information noise, misleading information, BS. These are all examples of entropic information that can have serious systemic consequences because they block the ways in which the system can understand its own constraints. So if the political institutional architecture leads to the production of certain kinds of information systems that create a frame of reference but deny others, then you run the risk that you are ignorant of the limitations of your own operational system. And this is what I mean when I talk about the United States being in late stage entropy. For a society, a social economic system that has been remarkably successful in harnessing, these low energy return on energy information systems to create this incredible information architecture that has delivered, entertainment and all sorts of things for people. To actually now be at a stage where the information costs of its own information systems are so high that it's starting to feed back on itself. And I have in my mind often that Greek mythical creature, the Ouroboros, right, the snake eating on itself.
Yeah.
And I often think of things like data centers for AI in the United States as an informational Ouroboros, where it is consuming such a large amount of energy on the promises of being negentropic that in fact it is eating itself. And in the process, also claiming more surplus energy potential from the system that would otherwise have been available to other kinds of economic and social activities, further accelerating system entropy. Right. So they're the sorts of things that I think, for mine, are important things to be watching out for now, in the mid 2020s.
I find this approach fascinating because I haven't heard it before. I haven't thought about it before. But so what about this kind of information, or use of productive capacities, especially of energy, for things that are themselves like inherently uh, increasing net entropy. Like, to me, the number one thing or social phenomenon that does this, and that I try to fight against, is war. War inherently is an increase in entropy because you're destroying the productive capacities of each other and whatnot, and you're using a lot of energy, tons of energy. And we see that with even just the CO2 that the US war machine
Yeah.
produces, right? In tremendous amounts. And in that sense, if you look at it, international relations from that way, you would say that one entity tries to increase its own or decrease its own entropy by increasing entropy somewhere else. And if you do that on a systemic level, then, well, you will destroy actually the fundaments.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Right. So when we start to think of global systems as being, and nation states as being, thermodynamic systems in and of themselves, then we can start to understand the sources of conflict, where the energetic efficiency or declining efficiency of a nation state begins to spill over as it seeks to make claims on the energetic potentials elsewhere, Venezuela, etc., etc. Right? These are claims that are being made on what are in effect higher EROEI possibilities, right, by the United States, as it itself starts to confront its own limitations. It's also had a tremendous run over the last 20 years with shale and things like that, right, which were incredibly low, low resource intensive activities to access. Certainly not as low resource intensive as the oil, back in the day when you literally walk through the fields sloshing through oil as it bubbled up to the surface. But as these pressures build in the system, where the energetic return on energy invested progressively declines, the people who are at the coalface of these systems, so to speak, actually understand the challenges that they face. And the system itself ultimately pushes actors to seek ways in which it can replenish its energetic potential. And sometimes that's through war. And so, and at the same time, it also seeks to deny others access to energy as well.
But that's a purely exploitative view of
Yes.
why these societies do that. But I think your point earlier also was that if then systems go into this moment where they cannot produce, where the output decreases, right? Not just the monetary output, but the actual thermodynamic potential of the future. That then is part of the spiral of decline, right? And which in
Yep.
a sense, if I understood you correctly, is almost inevitable.
Well, it's a continual battle in a sense, in that these entropic trajectories are embedded within the system. What we're constantly seeking to do is to counter them through negentropic interventions. Now, conflict actually is not a very good way at all for some of the reasons that you've described as a way of dealing with entropy.
So,
Uh,
so
because
just a
there's,
question.
yeah,
So in your sense, like then redistributive mechanisms to make sure that people have access and can use that for their own purposes, like social redistribution system, would be in your sense a net entropic, net negative entropic intervention, right?
yeah, right. And you see this at a macro scale as well, at a global level, because if the energy consumed in fighting wars to access available energy could actually be better used finding new solutions that everybody can use, right? So you've got to
Yeah.
punch through energetic systems, right? So as I said, we've had an incredible couple of 100 years, but we are also on the cusp of all sorts of additional supplementary and possibly additive systems now, right? So people often talk about energy transitions. I'm not so convinced that we transition per se, because what we have tended to do historically is keep adding things on top of other things. And we meaning humans, often continue to exploit nature even more intensely as we've added more alternative energy sources, right? So we use more timber today than we've ever used before, even in the days when we were burning timber. So what I think we tend to do, and there is an argument, so the degrowth folk and others, so there's a view that this is not viable, right? But put that aside for the time being. If what humans historically do is continue as on our path of complexity, is discover new energetic possibilities within nature, then we keep adding these things. Now, what we've got to understand about this energy equation is that we're not just looking at the energetic properties of the production, the harnessing of that information. We also need to consider the energetic uh, efficiency of its utility value as well. So it needs to be easy to use. It needs to generate, efficient uses. But there's a third dimension, and this is where information actually becomes really important, because we also consume a lot of energy and also waste a lot of energy through um, uh, poor coordination. And
Right.
so systemic flows, if the system can flow smoothly, it's actually achieving very, very high levels of energetic efficiency. Wherever there are blockages within a system, uh, and I guess perhaps this thinking draws a lot both from very traditional Asian and Chinese cosmologies, if you will, but also from traditions in classical economics, right? Whether it was some of the French physiocrats or Ricardo and Marx and others who really tried to understand this system not as a a, a price-based clearing market optimization system, but as a system of transformation and flow.
Yeah.
The question is how do you sustain smooth flows in a world that's continually changing? So what we're trying to do is have more energetically efficient ways of capturing and harnessing energy, number one. Secondly, we need that to be as dense as it can possibly be, um, so that it has the potential for use in a managed temporal setting. We then need the ways of using all of that, right? So there's no point having incredibly efficient, uh, you know, energy capturing systems if the way that we use it is actually pretty inefficient. So we need to continue the efforts to upgrade our production coefficients, right, which is the input-output ratio. How much energy goes in to get how much energy return on energy invested as a utility at the other side. So we need to continually upgrade that. And we need to continually upgrade the circulation system itself. So the extent to which something can be harnessed, transformed, and circulated are intertwined with each other. And if we are unsuccessful in these three sort of core components, and by the way, we are always, in a sense, partly unsuccessful. And we're partly unsuccessful because we have epistemological limits about the extent to which we can know the world and the extent to which the world and the future is uncertain, right? So we make errors. We go down the wrong paths of things. We have sunk costs. Sometimes they're path dependent, which creates all sorts of problems, right? When we make mistakes at systemic levels. But the successful societies happen to be the ones who are able, by and large, to get their act together across all three of these domains.
Yeah, you got to figure all three of them out.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's quite interesting because I would say the two largest sources, of course, of energy and of ways of creating the system that you talked about in the last 100 years are definitely, on the one hand, hydrocarbons that we're talking about, oil and gas and so on, and they're easy to store and transfer and price and whatnot. The other one is, of course, nuclear energy, which is another one of these ways. But unfortunately, the electricity that comes out on the other end is notoriously hard to store. Therefore, inefficiency increases then over there. But if we take this theory of yours as a basis, like, where does that leave you with the analysis of how today's global society is working or not working, actually?
Well, I think there's going to be some things that are quite clearly going to emerge, particularly out of the aftermath of the conflict in West Asia. There's going to be, I think, a high likelihood of physical relative shortages compared to the state of the world before the conflict blew up. There will be less oil and less gas in absolute terms coming from that part of the world, in part because I think we have quite a lot of infrastructure and resource destruction to come. Right?
Oh,
I hope I'm wrong on that, but if I'm right on that, that there is going to be a lot more energetic system destruction, then it will force a whole range of changes and have implications. It is quite clear that when there are significant shortages like this, that obviously an immediate symptom of that is pricing. And pricing then leads to the distributional issues that we discussed earlier. There is no doubt that periods of supply side shock around key resources that then percolate across the economic system through all of the complex networks and connections that these resources are part of, ultimately will lead to a dramatic reduction in the quality of life and the affordability of life for a large proportion of people relative to those who will capture the short-term monetary profits that arise from this pricing situation.
Yeah.
That's number one. And that runs the risk of its own entropic potential. If enough people's lives are dislocated and their lives are made miserable and nothing is done about that, then who knows what will happen. I'm often reminded, Pascal, of a movie I watched in the 1990s called The Trigger Effect, which was made in Hollywood but never made it huge, possibly because the narrative or the main theme was a little bit dark. But it was basically a story following a series of characters whose lives became intersected over the course of a few days after the city that they lived in lost electricity. Right? And as events unfolded, the drugstores would close, the security guards would now need to be armed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You could see social entropy manifest itself. The second thing I think this is going to force many places around the world to do is look at their energetic structure, the ways in which they have organized their historic affairs to deliver food for people, fuel for machines. And they will inevitably seek ways of accelerating a transition to systems that are less dependent upon hydrocarbons that must be transported across long distances and through geographically controlled gates.
Yeah. Yeah. The Strait of Hormuz, Strait of Malacca. Yeah.
And the rest, right?
Yeah.
So when that happens, we're going to see, in fact, a new rush to a diverse range of energy possibilities, all of which we actually understand. We have, for instance, the electrification boom that's taken place in China in the last 15 years. The technologies that have made that possible will actually come into more demand globally. First thing. Second thing is that as gas prices continue to rise, I think we are going to see green hydrogen and hydrogen in general become a financially more affordable alternative and will actually begin to play a more prominent role. Also, we have obviously developments in nuclear and the smaller nuclear modules. And in the longer term, we have the fusion technologies that I think are now firstly part of China's current 5-year plan. But we also know that China's made some significant advances in that space. Now, those advances are unlikely to really hit the ground until 2040, 2045, 2050. But they will hit the ground as the current generation of renewable energy infrastructure begins to run its course, right? So that's that first level. I think the second thing that's likely to happen, Pascal, is we're going to see um, uh, ongoing energetic efficiency initiatives in the utilization of energy, right? So more efficient factories, automations, dark factories, digitalization, et cetera, et cetera. But we're also, and this I think is probably the most interesting and potentially geopolitically most interesting and under theorized part as yet, is the role of nano electric systems to transform the ways in which data is collected at the edges and in which data is processed at the edges. So rather than having large scale centralized data centers doing the heavy lifting on AI, there is every likelihood that in the 5 to 10 year window, we will start to see a lot more of that compute pushed to the edges. We're also going to see a lot more data collection taking place at the edges, fueled by things like localized energy capturing capabilities. So technologies like TENGS, TENGS, which is micro technologies that enable the harnessing of basically nature, movement, wind, and all of that at a micro level, can then harness the energy to fuel the little sensors that we're deploying in lots of places. So I suspect we're going to see transformations there. We're also going to see transformations in other kinds of technologies too, that will impact the ways in which grids work and the way that grids and grid-enabled AI systems work as well. One of the things that will emerge as a result of the war in West Asia is, many people have talked about this, but is the reduction in the supply of sulfur, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, and of course, for many people, that's important for fertilizers and all those sorts of things.
Growing
But it's
things,
also important. But it's also important because sulfur is necessary for the mining and the separation of copper from the ores, supporting about 20% or thereabouts of global copper supplies. So one of the things that is likely to emerge as a result of this, and it won't manifest itself for 6 to 12 months, is a tightening of copper supplies globally. And as copper supplies tighten globally, systems that have been dependent upon copper, such as electricity network augmentations and upgrades to support data centers, will begin to come under pressure. Now, the first thing that'll happen is that the prices will go up, the data centers will get priority, the secondary industries and the households will again come under the sorts of pressures I talked about before. The electricity haves and electricity have-nots will become a greater social and political problem. And we're then going to see one last push, in a sense. That creates the space in which alternates to copper will find their opportunity to play. So materials like graphene will begin to play an even greater role in the development of electronics, because it is highly conductive and available. And again, China's mastered the graphene production at scale. So they're the sort of dynamics that we're going to start to see. The extent to which a society can harness those, or will, in a sense, reject all of this because it's holding on, that inertia is stopping it from embracing this process of energetic renewal. If a society struggles with energetic renewal in this era, it is going to experience increasing contradictions at a social level as competition for a diminishing amount of surplus energy begins to manifest itself.
That is a very interesting way of looking at it. Does that then lead you to this does that lead you actually to the conclusion that much of the warfare that we are seeing in West Asia is actually about this kind of about reversing such trends one way or another, or is it just the inability to understand the way in the global economy and the global political economy in the sense that you are describing it? Is it an outcome or is it more of a feature of the system?
Look, I think it's partly a system feature, but it's a feature that is percolated not in a determinative sense, in that these thermodynamic fundamentals within our material system continue to work away. But how humans respond to these pressures is actually the bit that humans can do something about, right? And that requires a way of framing the issues at stake. And my argument is that we need to frame the issues as surplus energetic questions, right? And they need to be understood not in zero sum terms, because that leads to very suboptimal energetic pathways, which of course are destructive, you know, death, destruction, and all of that. So that's an important, I guess, corollary. I mean, I didn't write this book with these wars in mind, I must say, but clearly, I think that there is a need for societies around the world to reframe their shared concerns around global energy possibilities. That's one. Secondly, I think we need to actually have a more nuanced understanding of circulation systems, right? So, as financial circulation gets clogged up because there's concerns, people are holding on, so it's not flowing as smoothly. The temptation is just to, squeeze more liquidity into the system. We call that fiscal policy, right? Or quantitative easing or what have you. That helps kick the can down the road a bit, but it can actually amplify the problems, because if you don't solve circulation and distribution problems at root, you're actually just going to make them worse. And the third thing that I think we need to be thinking more about increasingly is the ways in which the is actually how it is that information systems enable flows to happen smoothly, right? And if we can't come to grips on this one planet where we have many languages but nonetheless need interoperability, and ultimately arrive at information systems that are not threats to our collective existences, but are actually the ways in which we can better coordinate and collaborate, then we're going to fail ourselves. Right? So we need to think a lot harder about information systems. We need to think a lot more clearly about information sovereignty plus information interoperability, right? Because you need the sovereignty to mitigate risk, but you need the interoperability to ensure a collective negentropic effort. And these are the things that I think we need to be thinking a lot more about.
Yeah, and put them into concrete examples and so on, right? Of how, for instance, China is trying very hard to have this information or data sovereignty. On the other hand, you still need to exchange information with the Russians in order to get your hands on their hydrocarbons and so on, right?
Yeah.
So there's a whole lot of things to solve also within BRICS and whatnot. Just one question, because
Yeah.
I I never thought of the global economy in your terms. How many people do have this kind of thermodynamic understanding of the global economy? Is that a school of thought? Is that kind of, or is it your project that you've been developing?
Yeah. Look, as I said, this is a work of synthesis.
Mm.
There are real giants who've worked in, going back to the 1970s, who've really thought about the ecological and thermodynamic constraints and conditionality of economic systems. So I wouldn't say that this is particularly original. What I would say, and I guess my attempt to make a contribution, is to create some synthesis between the ways in which we understand the thermodynamic substrate, the ways that we can understand the information systems itself, where I do argue, as I said, that information is not necessarily always negentropic,
Mhm.
and also how we need to embed the way we think about endogenous money and this idea of money as a claim on the future and a unit of account, um, embed it within a material system. because otherwise we begin to get too obsessed, in a sense, with monetary flows
Yep.
and monetary operations and monetary um, uh, effects, such as balance sheet corrections, forgetting that the only reason why these things actually happen is because of the disjuncture between these units of account and these claims on the future and what the material substrate will actually ultimately be able to deliver on. So we need to take an integrated, holistic view. That's probably the main thing. There's an Australian economist, Steve Keen, who many people will no doubt know, who has talked a lot about the need to bring energy back into the way we think about economics. And Steve's actually got a much nicer turn of phrase than I do. When I talk about food for people and fuel for machines, I think Steve has something along the lines of a body without food is a corpse, and a machine without fuel is a no, it's a sculpture, something like that.
Ah,
But he does have a beautiful turn of phrase which captures this idea that without energy, there is actually nothing. Um, so no, look, I think the work that I try and do certainly sits at the nexus of a series of traditions.
yep.
As I mentioned, I also draw deeply from the traditions of classical economics, which tries to think about our social, political, and economic systems and predicaments in holistic terms, and in terms that are more interested in dynamics and motion, anchored by the idea that we are in production systems at the end of the day. Without production, nothing else matters. And so understanding the centrality of production is actually key. And this is a contrast to mainstream economics, which has become obsessed with allocation, right?
Yeah.
And so for 100 years, mainstream economics is concerned about the question of allocation. One of my microeconomics textbooks when I was doing micro 30 odd years ago was the price system and resource allocation, right?
Supply
That
and
was
demand.
right. And so as people, if they read the book, they'll see that in fact, this whole book is actually largely about how not to think about economic systems through the lens of supply and demand. But to think about them in terms of networks and flows.
Yeah.
So certainly part of a tradition. The other thing I will say, just very briefly, Pascal, we touched on this before we came on air, is that this particular initiative is an experiment in and of itself. Um, uh, my last book on information systems and supply chains was published by a very well-known academic publishing house, and I was very grateful for that. It was a great experience to work with people at that level. The downside with that is two things. One is that it takes a long time.
Yep.
So academic publishing cycles, as I'm sure you know, and many of
Years.
is years. And so it's hard to get things out there. And I guess I wanted to at least have these conversations. The second thing is that the model around academic publishing is now very institutionally oriented, which means that the price of books is really very, very high. And in discussions with a number of publishers around this particular book, we were looking at possible price points of between 150 and 400 US dollars per book,
Insane.
which I think is insane. It defeats the purpose of doing what we do. So I chose a particular self-publishing path, which is to do this on using Kindle Direct Publish and Amazon. It's not everyone's cup of tea. Some of the people who've bought books have said, can I buy them straight from you? Because I don't want to, buy them from, that particular platform. But it is an experiment because I think we need to be constantly exploring ways in which we can circulate and share the fruits of our own productive efforts in ways that are accessible and affordable to people. And so, hopefully this little experiment works.
Yes, we do. And just let me add just 1 minute because I need to rant about this just a little bit. Because 400 years ago, these publishers and especially academic publishers had a very important role to play in the system because reproducing information is very, very expensive because you need a lot of people who then typeset this stuff and then make the ink and put the papers and whatnot. The paper itself was expensive. So you needed a big collective effort, which you can only do if you do upfront investment, and which means downstream, what comes out of it needs to be sold, etc., and then also given to the university. So this was an information distribution system, and the price was just high because we were poor at doing this. Today, copying information is literally, you can do it literally at the click of a button, right? Any kind of copy paste. But what the model then transformed into is its opposite. While the old system had a price in order to distribute information, the new system actually gatekeeps. So the new system, the new game in town of all the publishers, academic publishers and private trade presses and so on, is to actually restrict the access to information and then make you pay in order to go through the toll gate, right? And that's just it's horrible, but that's what it has morphed into, and what the game actually is about. So I'm glad that you're going a different route, which we all have to figure out somehow.
It's an experiment like a lot of the things we've been working on, and I'll report on its success or otherwise in time, no doubt. I am working with a couple of other publishers on more mainstream activities, in part because some of my colleagues are at an earlier stage in their academic careers, and I think it would still be of value to them to work with the established publishing houses. But by the time you reach, my vintage, that is less important. And look, I was lucky too, Pascal. I had a graphic design background from the days when I edited student newspapers at university. And the reason I'm not a graphic designer is because I was actually not very good at it. But I was nonetheless not frightened by the fact of having to lay out, a publication and those sorts of things. And so I was willing to dive back in and well, again, let's see how it goes. Some people have sent me photos of books arriving actually before authors' copies have been delivered. So I actually don't have a hard copy myself, but other people around the world do. So hopefully it will provoke a vocabulary of talking about these things in an integrated way, where we are, I think, more sensitive to the fact that our world doesn't revolve around financial claims. Our world ultimately is grounded by the physics of our existence.
Yeah, it's called the real economy. We gotta think about the real economy, and Warwick Powell is doing a wonderful job at exploring that in a very fascinating way, as you have just heard. Everybody, I encourage you, get yourself a copy of Thermoeconomics in a Time of Monsters. We didn't talk about Gramsci and about Time of Monsters, but I think we are all aware of what kinds of times we're going through at the moment. Warwick Powell, thank you very much for your time today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.